Good afternoon, my friend. I hope today finds you with a bit of sunlight coming through your window. Perhaps a cup of something warm beside you. If not, maybe just the quiet comfort of knowing someone out there is thinking of you. I've been meaning to talk to someone about something that's been sitting quietly in the corner of my heart. And maybe, just maybe, you felt it too. You see, the other morning, I was sitting at the breakfast table with my daughter and her family. It was a simple morning: cereal, scrambled eggs, a few slices of toast, and I was reaching out, almost out of habit, to help clear the dishes. My hands weren't as quick as they used to be, but the movement was familiar, comforting even. And then she said it, softly, kindly, with a smile. "It's okay, Dad. You just sit and relax. We've got this." She didn't mean anything by it, not really. There was no sharpness in her voice, no judgment. It was full of care, actually, but something inside me sank a little, like a pebble falling into a still pond. I nodded, withdrew my hand, and wrapped it around my warm mug of tea instead. But the tea didn't stay warm long, and neither did my heart. I sat there quietly, watching everyone move around me. My daughter and son-in-law clearing dishes, the kids running about, the clatter of plates and the sound of laughter rising and falling like a familiar old song. But I felt left out of the rhythm, as if the music no longer needed my part. I don't know if you've ever felt that way, like you're still in the room, but somehow not quite part of it, like someone quietly turned down the volume of your presence. Later that day, I kept turning her words over in my mind. "You just sit, that's all." 4 little words, but they kept echoing. I thought about how, all my life, I had been needed. I was the one people turned to for fixing things, for holding things together, for solving problems, lifting boxes, paying bills, offering advice, making jokes to cut the tension, driving people where they needed to be. I had a function, a place, and now my hands tremble just a little. My knees don't quite trust the stairs. I read a bit slower. Sometimes I forget what I came into the room for. And in that moment, when my daughter asked me to just sit and relax, I didn't feel honored or cared for. I felt unnecessary. Isn't that something? That the act of being cared for can sometimes feel like a gentle form of being dismissed? I know she didn't mean it that way, but my heart didn't know how else to take it. I wonder, friend, have you ever been told to just rest, and instead of feeling gratitude, you felt grief? That morning I spent a long time sitting alone, looking at my hands. These hands that once held so many tools, carried babies, fixed broken doors, patted backs, cooked meals. I could see the stories in them, in the lines and the little scars. I whispered quietly to them, "You're still here." But a part of me wasn't sure that was enough. Isn't it strange how we measure our worth by what we do? That was the first day I began to wonder, if I wasn't useful, then what was I? And that, my dear friend, is what I want to talk to you about today. Because maybe you've asked yourself that question too. It wasn't always like this, you know. There was a time when my usefulness was my pride. When I was younger, stronger, faster, sharper, I believed my value came from how much I could do. For my family, for my friends, for my work, even for strangers. I was the man who got things done. The one people called when they needed a hand or a favor, or someone to show up and just take care of things. And to be honest, I liked it. No, more than liked it, I lived for it, because being needed felt like love. Have you ever felt that? That quiet glow when someone turns to you and says, "Could you help me with this?" It's not just about the task, it's the trust in their voice, the way their eyes meet yours as if you're the one person who can make things right. That was the language of love I understood. In my 20s and 30s, I learned that competence brings respect. In my 40s, I learned that reliability brings peace. In my 50s, I believed wholeheartedly that my presence was only welcome if it came with productivity. And so I worked hard, not just at my job, but at being good. Good at giving advice, good at being available, good at being the steady one in the storm. But now all of that is changing. My hands aren't as strong, my back aches, my energy flickers in the afternoon. I nap without meaning to. I forget names that used to be carved into my memory. And so I began to fear that without my usefulness, I would slowly disappear from the hearts of those I love. I didn't say it aloud, not at first, but the thought settled quietly inside me, like a tenant moving in uninvited. If I can't do things for them, why would they still want me around? It sounds silly when spoken, doesn't it? But deep down, so many of us carry that belief like an old family heirloom. We were raised to be helpful, to contribute, to prove our worth by our doing. It's how many of us were shown love, and it's how we learned to give it. I remember my own father. He was a man of few words but strong arms. He fixed everything around the house, always had dirt under his nails, and could carry entire conversations with just a look and a nod. When he stopped being able to do things in his final years, I saw something fade in his eyes. He felt replaced, and I promised myself back then that I would never let myself feel that way. But promises made in youth often falter in the quiet corridors of old age. Because here I am now, wrestling with the same shadows. I started counting the number of times I was asked for help each week. I noticed how often people said, "You don't have to do that," or "Let us handle it," or "You've done enough." And instead of feeling grateful for the rest, I felt unnecessary. There's an ache in realizing your sense of purpose was built entirely on what you could offer. What happens when the offering shrinks, when the muscles tire, when the mind stumbles? Have you ever found yourself apologizing for your slowness? For asking the same question twice? For needing help with something you used to do effortlessly? I have, and each apology felt like a pebble chipping away at my dignity. But what I didn't realize then was this. It wasn't the world taking away my value. It was me believing that my value was conditional in the first place. That unless I earned my place at the table through service, I didn't belong there. That love had to be bought with effort. That simply being, without doing, was not enough. How many of us live like that? Carrying invisible ledgers in our hearts, constantly checking if we've done enough to justify our presence? It's exhausting. And somewhere deep inside, we know it's not true. But unlearning a belief that once made you feel powerful, that takes time and tenderness. I've started asking myself now, would I ever look at my grandchild and say, "You're only loved when you're helpful"? Of course not. I love them because they exist, because they smile, because their very presence brings light. So why can't I offer that same grace to myself? Is usefulness a gift? Certainly, but it is not a requirement for love. And maybe, just maybe, the real work of this stage of life is not to do more, but to trust that we are still worthy even when we do less, even when we simply sit and breathe and remember. So now when I hear, "You don't have to do that," I try not to let it sting. Instead, I place my hands gently in my lap, take a breath, and remind myself, you are still here, and that is enough. There was a stretch of time not long ago, really, when I found myself speaking less and less. Not because I had nothing to say. Oh no, I had thoughts, memories, little stories tucked into my chest like folded letters. But I kept them sealed inside. Why? Because I didn't want to intrude. I began to notice how busy everyone was. My daughter running in and out of the kitchen trying to manage a dozen things at once. My son-in-law glued to his phone, answering work calls at the dinner table. My teenage grandchildren floating in and out of the house like quiet shadows, headphones in, eyes lowered. So I sat there, watching, waiting for a pause that never quite came. There was a moment one afternoon, the kind of moment that might seem small from the outside, but it landed heavily in my chest. My youngest grandson was crying in the living room. He had fallen, scraped his knee, and was sitting on the rug with big, round, wet eyes. I started to rise to comfort him like I used to do when my own kids were little. But just as I reached out my arms, I heard a voice from the kitchen, my daughter's, firm and fast. "It's okay, Dad. I've got him." And so I sat back down. I didn't say anything. I just stayed. She wasn't being cruel, not at all. She was simply doing what I once did, stepping up quickly, tending to her child with the urgency and instinct of a mother. But I realized in that moment that my instincts no longer had a place to land. Have you ever had a gesture rejected, not out of malice, but out of misalignment? As if you reached out with a gift and the world politely turned its back? It happened again and again in little ways. I'd hear my daughter sigh over the laundry, and I'd quietly begin folding some towels. She would smile, gently take them from my hands and say, "Really, Dad, you don't have to. Go rest." Rest. That word followed me like a shadow. Not the kind of rest that restores you, but the kind of rest that feels like exile, like being gently shelved. And so I learned to pull back, to avoid offering help unless asked, to keep my questions short and spaced out, to not mention the creaking door or the flickering hallway light or the fact that the little one seemed unusually quiet this week, because I didn't want to be too much, too present, too talkative, too opinionated, too outdated. And that fear of being a bother grew louder than my voice. I started talking to myself more than I spoke to others. Little mutterings under my breath. Memories retold in silence. Thoughts left to hang in the space between cups of tea. Some days I didn't speak more than a few words. Just enough to say good morning, thank you, or good night. And even those sometimes felt rehearsed, there's a loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being afraid to take up space in your own home. And that's what it felt like. I remember sitting in the backyard one evening, watching the dusk settle over the fence like a soft blanket. The house behind me was full, laughter, clinking dishes, the soft hum of a television. But I sat outside in the quiet because I wasn't sure I had a place in the noise. Isn't that something? To long for your own voice and still choose silence, to ache with the desire to connect and still retreat for fear of being unwelcome. I don't think anyone meant for me to feel that way. They love me, I know they do. But love, when rushed and distracted, can become hard to feel. And when you've spent a lifetime being useful, stepping aside starts to feel like disappearing. Have you ever caught yourself waiting for someone to ask your opinion? Not because you crave control, but because it would mean they still saw you, that your mind, your heart, Your lived experiences still held weight? I did, I do. And sometimes when the silence gets heavy, I close my eyes and remember a different time. When the house was smaller, the dinners louder, and my voice was part of the fabric of every room. But memory is a kind companion. It visits, but it doesn't stay. Now I sit quietly, not because I want to, but because I'm learning how to not feel rejected by the absence of an invitation. And that's a slow, delicate lesson. But I still hope in the quiet of the evening that someone might sit beside me, not because I have something to offer, but simply because I am still here. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because it was the first day in a long while that the morning didn't rush past me. The sun was up early, and the light came through the window in that soft, almost golden way that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. I didn't have any appointments, no errands, no chores waiting, so I took a walk just around the block, slow and steady, the way I have to now. Each step a little reminder of time's quiet passage. There's a small park not far from the house. You wouldn't think much of it. Just a patch of grass, a few benches, some tired trees that have seen better springs. But that morning it felt like sanctuary. I sat down on one of the old benches, the kind that creaks under your weight and leans just slightly to the left. It was early and the world was still yawning. And I did nothing. I didn't check the time. I didn't think about what needed fixing or what I should be doing instead. I just watched the leaves move, listened to the rustling branches, noticed a small bird hopping near my shoe as if asking for company. For the first time in a while, I allowed myself to be still without guilt. No role, no task, no usefulness, just presence. And then an old man approached. His steps were slow like mine. He carried a cane and wore a faded cap that probably meant something once, a souvenir from a life lived loudly. He didn't say much, just gave a nod and sat on the other end of the bench. For a while we sat there, two old men on a crooked bench, sharing the same silence. We didn't talk, didn't need to. There was something sacred in the quiet, like the world had paused just for us. After a while, he stood up, stretched his back, and said, almost as if talking to himself, but loud enough for me to hear, "Thanks, friend. I needed this more than I knew." Then he walked away. That was it. But those words, they stayed. I needed this more than I knew. He wasn't thanking me for advice or help or some story I'd told. He was thanking me for being there, just sitting, just breathing, just being. And something inside me, some tight knot I didn't even realize I'd been holding, began to loosen. Could it be, I wondered, that our presence alone can be a gift? That simply sharing space with another soul, even in silence, even in stillness, can bring comfort. It ran so deeply against everything I had once believed. I had lived a life convinced that value came from motion, that being meant doing, that to be loved, to be wanted, to matter, I had to contribute, to fix, to speak, to give. But that morning on that creaky old bench, I learned something new. That presence, quiet, unproductive, unadorned, can be powerful. I thought about all the times I had sat beside my wife when she was sad, offering no solution, just my hand in hers. Or the nights I watched over my children while they slept, keeping no one awake, but still keeping them safe. Those moments had value, deep, wordless value. And now here I was, on the other side of life, needing to relearn what I once gave so freely. That just sitting with someone, without trying to fix them or prove anything or fill the air with noise. That too was love. That afternoon, I walked home slowly, not because my knees demanded it, but because my heart was full. Full in that quiet, meaningful way that doesn't shout, but hums. Have you ever felt that? That soft humming inside when something finally makes sense? Not in your mind, but in your being? I began to understand that I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I didn't need to justify my place in a room, in a family, in this world. I was here, and sometimes that's enough. After that morning in the park, something inside me softened. It didn't happen all at once. Life never changes that quickly when you've lived long enough to know how the seasons turn. But I began to notice the shift, quiet, gentle, like a curtain being drawn open a little at a time. I stopped trying so hard to be helpful, not because I had given up, but because I had begun to understand that being helpful and being present aren't always the same thing. There was a day not long after when my wife was folding laundry in the living room. The old me, the one who still carried that instinct like armor, would have jumped up to grab the basket, reach for the towels, try to prove I still had it in me. But instead, I stayed in my chair by the window. I opened a book, not really to read, but just to sit beside her in quiet companionship. She didn't say anything, but I caught the way her shoulders eased. There was no rush, no tension, just the soft rhythm of cloth meeting hand and the sound of the pages turning. And I realized I didn't need to do the folding to be part of the moment. I was already in it, fully, warmly, completely. I began to show up differently after that. Instead of trying to stir the soup or carry the groceries or offer unsolicited advice, I just showed up. I sat with my grandson while he built towers out of blocks. I didn't tell him how to make them sturdier. I just watched. When they fell, I smiled. He looked up at me, and I could tell. He wasn't looking for a fix. He was just looking for someone to see him. And I was there. In the kitchen, I would linger, not to chop or stir, but to listen to the chatter, the hum of the house, my family's voices dancing from one topic to another, like birds in the branches of a familiar tree. I would catch my daughter glancing at me, surprised maybe that I wasn't trying to jump in. And then her eyes would soften, and we'd smile at each other. It's strange how powerful it feels to simply be there, quietly and be noticed. Not because you did anything, but because you are someone. You see, I started to understand something I never did when I was younger. Love doesn't always speak in action. Sometimes it whispers in presence. There is a kind of love that doesn't try to fix the leaking faucet or rush to wipe away every tear. It's the kind that pulls up a chair and says, I'm here, not to solve you, not to change you, but to be with you. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to become that kind of love. It took practice. There were still moments when I'd catch myself reaching for the broom or trying to straighten the cushions or interrupting with a solution nobody asked for. Old habits, after all, wear the deepest grooves. But I was learning to pause, to ask myself, am I doing this because it's needed or because I want to feel needed? That question alone changed me, because once I took away the pressure to prove my worth through usefulness, I found a new way of belonging, softer, stiller, but just as vital. I became the warmth in the room, the quiet witness to laughter, the steady breath behind the chaos of dinner prep, the calm that settled into bedtime stories. And in doing so, I found something surprising. I didn't feel useless anymore. I felt woven in, not as the engine, but as part of the fabric. Maybe you felt it too, that quiet ache of wanting to matter without having to hustle, lift, explain, or impress. If you have, let me tell you something, friend. You don't have to chase your place in the world anymore. You already have it. Sometimes your most important role is to be the one who stays, not to help, not to fix, but to love, silently, patiently, and without condition. I began to stay, and in staying, I became more a part of this home than ever before. I've thought a lot lately about what I used to need when I was younger. Not the kind of needs that show up on shopping lists or in to-do notes stuck to the fridge, but the deeper ones, the quiet, aching ones that live just beneath the surface. There were days when I came home tired from work, shoulders heavy with things I couldn't name. Days when the world outside felt too loud, too fast, too full of expectations. And what I wanted most, more than answers, more than advice, was for someone to simply be there. Not to fix me, not to push me, just to sit nearby and let me exhale. I didn't know how to ask for that back then. Maybe I thought it was selfish. Maybe I didn't even know that's what I needed. But now, all these years later, I've come to understand the most generous gift you can give someone is your unconditional presence. Just being there. Not because you're needed for a task, not because you're obligated, not because there's something to accomplish, but because your love isn't trying to prove anything. I've tried to offer that now in the way I show up. I don't bring answers anymore. I bring a listening ear. I don't rush to anticipate what others need. I let them find their own rhythm, and I walk beside them quietly. When my granddaughter curls up next to me and says nothing, I don't ask her what's wrong. I just rest my hand over hers and let her know I'm here. When my wife moves slower in the morning, I don't rush her. I sit at the table, sip my tea, and let the silence bloom between us like a morning flower. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone will turn to me. Not because they need anything, but because they know I'll receive them with softness. That, I've come to realize, is what I needed all along. Not grand gestures, not impressive words, just someone to stay and see me and say, even in silence, you don't have to be anything more than what you already are. I wonder, my friend, have you ever felt that? That deep longing, not for someone to solve you, but to simply accept you? To say with their eyes, you don't have to earn your place in this moment. We live in a world that measures everything: productivity, usefulness, success. But no one ever taught us how to measure presence. Because you can't. It can't be counted, weighed, or scheduled. It's felt. Like the warmth of sunlight on your skin. Like the quiet strength of a tree that never moves but always stays. And in old age, when the doing falls away, we finally begin to understand the power of being. I think of my younger self and how hard he worked to be needed, how afraid he was of fading into the background, how he clung to usefulness like it was the only way to be loved. If I could sit beside him now, I'd gently take his hand and whisper, "You never had to prove anything. Your presence was always enough." And maybe that's the truth we only come to understand when everything else quiets down, when the world finally lets us sit still. Now, I don't rush to speak. I let people talk or not talk. I show up when I can, and I stay even when I can't do anything. Because presence, unconditional, unmeasured, and unforced, is not just enough, it is everything. This morning I sat in my usual chair by the window. It's an old chair, faded at the arms where my hands have rested thousands of times, the cushion a little thinner than it used to be. But it fits me. the way old things sometimes do, better than anything new ever could. Outside, the world was stirring. The mail truck passed by. A neighbor walked their dog. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone was making breakfast. The scent of toast drifted in and settled around me like an old friend. And I smiled. Not because of anything grand, not because something had changed, but because I had changed. You see, I no longer feel like I'm fading. I'm still here. No longer rushing to be useful, no longer grasping for a role to play. Just here, quietly, softly, like a shadow that stays not because it's needed, but because it belongs. My days are simpler now. I don't lift heavy boxes. I don't fix broken things. I don't chase after grandchildren in the yard like I used to. But I do hold the baby while my daughter folds laundry. I hum old songs in the hallway when the house is too quiet. I sit at the edge of the garden and tell the dog she's doing a fine job just sniffing the wind. And I've come to believe, honestly and truly, that these small things, they matter. Not because they're productive, but because they're true. I show up, I stay, I listen. Sometimes I forget a name or misplace my reading glasses and we laugh. Other times I get quiet and no one minds. I've stopped apologizing for existing gently. That used to be hard for me. I used to think I had to earn every breath, every seat at the table, every moment of someone's time. But now I know I am allowed to take up space just as I am. Not as a helper, not as a contributor, just as a person, a human, a heart that still beats and remembers and feels deeply. And do you know what's most beautiful? The people around me, my family, my friends, even the neighbors who wave as they pass. They feel that shift too. There's a softness between us now, a kind of peace that doesn't need permission. Because when you stop trying to prove you belong, you make room for everyone else to rest too. We become, in our quiet presence, a permission slip for others to slow down, breathe, and simply be. I think a lot about legacy these days, and I've decided mine won't be built on how much I accomplished or how many problems I solved. It will be built on how I made people feel when I stayed, when I sat beside them without needing to speak, when I saw them and didn't ask them to change, when I made a space where love didn't come with a receipt. I don't help much anymore, but I am still a part of this place, of this family, of this home, of this world. And as long as I draw breath, I will be here, with my soft chair, my quiet hands, and my full, steady heart. I won't rush to fix. I won't try to earn. I'll just love, as gently and deeply as I can. And maybe that is enough. Maybe it always was. So let me ask you, my dear friend, have you been pulling away from the world, not because it asked you to, but because you thought you had to? Have you been measuring your worth by how many things you can still do? If so, maybe today is the day you sit quietly, rest your hands in your lap, and remind yourself, I am still here. I am still love. And I am still part of this place, part of the... Well, my friend, if you're still here, still listening, then let me say something I don't say often enough. Thank you. Not just for your time, though time is precious. Not just for your attention, though I felt it like a warm shawl over my shoulders. But thank you for being here, for allowing me to sit beside you in spirit for these few quiet moments, for making space in your day for this conversation that isn't really about teaching or fixing, but about remembering. Remembering that we are still here, that we still matter, and that love doesn't come with conditions. You see, somewhere along the winding road of life, Many of us started to believe that our value was tied to our usefulness, that unless we were doing, we were somehow disappearing. But today, here with you, I want to leave you with something softer, something truer. Your presence is already a gift. You just as you are in this moment, whether you're moving fast or moving slowly, whether you're full of energy or wrapped in stillness, you are enough. You don't have to entertain. You don't have to be clever. You don't have to fill the silence. Sometimes your quiet company is exactly what the world needs. Sometimes just staying is the most loving thing you can do. And if no one has told you this in a while, let me be the one to say it. You belong, not because of what you do, not because of what you've done, but because you are a presence in this world, a quiet grace, a steady light. And I hope, truly, deeply hope, that you let yourself rest in that truth. So as this little tea time draws to a close, I'll say what I would say to an old friend walking out the door, coat in hand, eyes kind and smiling. You don't have to be useful to be loved. You already are. Let's meet again someday, perhaps on another quiet afternoon, with another story to share and another cup of something warm between us. Until then, take gentle care. And if the world gets noisy, remember this voice, mine, yours, ours, whispering back, I am still here and that is enough. With warmth always,